Dr. Kaufman talked about something very important, and that is preventing the formation of advanced glycation end products in your body. And one way of doing that is using a relatively new class of drug known as an SGL2 inhibitor. It reduces glycation and a lot more to delay biological aging. This was taken out of a medical journal showing the horrific effects that occur when blood glucose is high. All of those pathologies you see in gray are caused by persistently elevated levels of glucose. It's an absolute toxin in our body. We want to lower it as much as possible. Cornell published something just a year ago talking about something that everyone's known for decades, and that is excess glucose is going to clog your arteries. It creates inflammatory reactions that contribute to atherosclerosis. We don't want to have excess glucose circulating in our body. But the question is, what level of fasting glucose is toxic? Where should we put that upper limit threshold so that we make sure we stay below that level? And by the way, as a personal note, I've been challenged with fasting glucose. I've been able to control virtually all my vascular risk factors, but glucose would stay around 98, sometimes get up to 105. And here I am, lightweight, taking metformin, intermittent fasting, doing everything I should be doing, and yet my glucose was stubbornly around that 98 to 105 area. It made me very nervous, and I'll tell you why. Study done, 1999, looked at a huge number of men, middle-aged men, healthy, and men with fasting glucose levels above 85 milligrams per deciliter had a 40% increased risk of cardiovascular death. And as a member of this church, we don't want to die. And the idea that I had a marker that I could not control, I wanted to do something about it. And by the way, back in the 1980s, when I started this mission to control aging and slow the risk of dying, well, doctors were looking at fasting glucose up to 139 and saying, that's normal, that's okay. Well, thank goodness, a couple decades later, they recognized glucose levels over 99 milligrams per deciliter is not good. That's considered high. But that study published with many men looking at fasting glucose levels over 85 milligrams per deciliter increased the risk of cardiovascular death. So I needed to move my glucose level down. I got it down to 84 with a brand new class of medication. And if you understand the mechanisms of toxicity of excess glucose, endothelial dysfunction, atherosclerosis, inflammation, loss of insulin sensitivity, we need glucose to stay alive, but too much of it would be like taking gasoline out of a car and just spilling it everywhere and throwing matches around. You're literally risking death. And that is what, unfortunately, a lot of people have, unfortunately. About 10 years ago, we did a survey of our health-conscious supporters. 77% of them had fasting glucose above 85 milligrams per deciliter, putting them at a higher risk of death. So what is the fasting glucose level you want to target to achieve? Well, you want to be kind of under 85, because something over 85 is toxic. And I made this to demonstrate the fact that glucose is not anything we should take for granted if it's above 85. We should do what we can to lower it. But that's been challenging, including for me. So a relatively new class of drugs, this came out in 2013. SGL2 inhibitors, stands for sodium glucose cotransporter 2. And these drugs inhibit the ability of kidneys to put all the glucose back into your blood every time they filtrate it out. And just so you understand how the kidneys work, you've got a red arrow, and I've really tried to make this simplistic. About 50 gallons a day of blood circulates through our kidneys. So the sodium glucose goes in that red renal artery going into the kidney, and virtually 100% of it comes right back out. And yet, most of us have more glucose and sodium than what we want. If you take an SGL2 inhibitor drug, you shunt more of that glucose out of circulation into your urine for disposal. It's a great way to lower fasting glucose, A1C, fasting insulin. It's a great way to bring down those toxic glycemic markers using this one medication along with a healthy diet and some physical activity. You never want to rely on just one drug. But I hope everyone can understand this. blood going into your kidneys. The kidney has an option. It can send all the sodium and glucose back out, which it does, because if you understand with evolution, people used to starve to death. They were malnourished. And if your kidneys removed glucose and sodium, you would die in a malnourished state. But in our era of overabundance, most of us eat more than what we need, we continue to have higher levels of glucose than what are optimal, and as a result, we're dying prematurely. So the most efficient way right now for people who have stubbornly high glucose levels, that's over 85 milligrams per deciliter, is to consider one of the SGL2 inhibitor medications. They're out there. A number of them are out there. They're expensive, by the way. If you're diabetic, your insurance will cover it. If you're not, you may want to buy from Canada or many other countries. That's the way I get mine, is I find a place in some other country and just bring it in and use it myself at a very low cost. So your objective, if your glucose is stubbornly high, A1C is stubbornly high, if you're diabetic certainly, you get on one of these SGL2 inhibiting drugs and you're able to urinate out excess glucose and sodium. And that doesn't mean you should just use this drug alone. Hey, eat healthy, engage in some physical activity, continue with your metformin. But if you can't get your glucose down to that target level, we'll do something about it. And this is the data on the cardiovascular risk reductions in response to the SGL2 inhibiting drug. And this is approved by the FDA. This data was validated in many studies. The FDA allows a drug company to talk about this. 37% reduction in your risk of cardiovascular death. A 39% reduced risk of going to a hospital. And people know me, I hate hospitals. So if I can take something that reduces my risk of being hospitalized, I'm going to take that drug. But what's most important on this slide is diabetics taking the SGL2 inhibitors, drugs, they had a 56% reduced rate of all-cause mortality. Any cause of death, if you're on this drug, you reduce that risk by 56%. So I felt compelled to let this group know there's a medication out there right now that can reduce your risk of dying. And I hate to say this, the reason I know about this is someone who attended almost all of our services, he had severe type 2 diabetes. He was cautious about drugs. I convinced him finally to get on the SGL2 inhibitor. He goes to his doctor. Doctor said, you know what, I've heard about those. I don't know how to prescribe them yet. And it's a challenge for doctors. There's so many new anti-diabetic meds, they don't understand how to use them properly. Well, we're learning how to use them, and I'm using it personally, but that person could have been alive had this information been conveyed, which is why I'm conveying it to you now before it's all been peer-reviewed by my scientific group. I run everything I present to you normally by a lot of high-level people, but we're not going to see each other live until next October, of this year. And I want to get this information out to anyone whose fasting glucose is over 85 milligrams per deciliter, whose A1C is over 5.0. And by the way, optimal A1C levels, you like to drop it below 5.0%. It's very hard to do. This drug can help you do it. And cancer, well, this was a meta-analysis of lots and lots of studies, and this was just an association, but diabetics taking the SGL2 inhibitor drugs, 65% reduction in them contracting cancer. If that's all these drugs did, by the way, I would be taking them. But they do a lot more than just reduce cancer risk. They benefit the kidneys in multiple ways. People who are suffering from various stages of kidney failure who get on these drugs, they stop progressing. In some measures, they start to improve renal function. If you're over age 65, well, you get about a 50% chance of having some renal impairment. And a lot of people have rather significant kidney disease, stage 2, 3, and when it moves to stage 4, you need to go on dialysis or get a kidney transplant. If you're on this kind of drug and you're diabetic, wow, you reduce the risk of progressing to more advanced stage kidney disease. This is huge. A few doctors understand that, by the way. Most do not. They think that SGL2 inhibitors, because they work in the kidneys, are going to damage renal function. The more enlightened ones understand, get that patient who's suffering from stage 2, 3, 4 kidney disease, get them on this drug, and maybe you'll regress the decline in kidney function. Very, very important. And salt. How can we avoid salt when they just lace our foods with it nowadays? I barely have to use salt anymore because the food itself is excessively salted. Well, not only do these SGL2 inhibitors remove excess glucose, they help remove excess sodium. So if you have a blood pressure issue, this can at least help with that blood pressure, get that lower so that you get to live longer. I think most of you have heard my talks on hypertension. You ideally want to be around 115 systolic or lower. And the average person our age, frankly, is about 140, 150. We need to move blood pressure levels down. This is a convenient way to do this. This is what the FDA allows the company, Eli Lilly, who makes Jardiance. They can make this health claim. And normally the FDA is very stringent as to what kind of health claims you can make. But people, being diabetic people, taking the Jardiance drug, 38% fewer cardiovascular deaths, which corroborates everything else we know about how these drugs work. They reduce risk of stroke, heart disease, cancer, kidney stones even. People who take these drugs have a 50% reduction of kidney stones. It's incredible. So if you realize how much excess glucose is in a type 2 diabetic's body, it's shocking. Shocking. I've only learned this a couple days ago. I need to run this by some higher level people. But from what we were able to pull out of the scientific data, if you're healthy, you'll urinate out about 65 milligrams of glucose a day. It doesn't even get picked up on a test because it's so low. 65 milligrams. If you are a type 2 diabetic with severe disease, you may be urinating out 16,000 milligrams. We have there at 16.2 grams. But instead of 65 milligrams, you may be urinating out 16,000, or you may be urinating out a lot more, 80 to over 100 grams of glucose a day. Well, one of the drugs, the SGLT2 inhibitor drugs, carbaglyphosine, this drug was used in 3 different doses, and it was able to increase urinary excretion of glucose in a huge way. And the more glucose that comes out in your urine, the less glucose there is in circulating blood. So it's a great way to add to other anti-diabetic therapies. But if you're not diabetic, I'm taking it to get my glucose levels into the optimal range under 85. I'm going to increase my dose of Jardiance pretty soon to try to move it from 84 down to around 76. That's probably the optimal level. Because remember, high levels of glucose, that contributes to glycation and pretty much every disease out there. Inflammation, hypertension, pretty much everything out there. So the big question is side effects. Well, you're urinating out lots and lots of glucose. What's going to happen? If you have bacteria or fungi, if you're prone to urinary tract infections, that sugar is going to feed the bacteria and fungi. So there's a little bit of an increased risk of urinary tract infections. And I don't want to belittle that in any way. For some people, those turn serious. They can even turn into sepsis. So if you're going to get on this drug, well, drink your cranberry juice, look at different ways to reduce the risk of yeast and fungi infections. And, well, make a choice. But it's such a tiny percent of people who have this risk. There are some urinary difficulties sometimes where you urinate a little bit more than what you want. But again, it's only 3% of the people on the SGLT2 inhibitor as opposed to 1% in the placebo group. So the biggest concern really is just these urinary tract infections. There's ways to treat those for the most part, and there's ways to potentially prevent them. So these are the risks pretty much of using this class of drug. Urinary tract issues. I don't think constipation occurs that often, but the increased thirst, yeah, I have a little bit of that. A little bit of increased urination, I don't appreciate it, but still, small price to pay for all of the benefits. So I put these 2 panels together so we can compare the risks and benefits. And you look at the risks in red on the left, and yeah, urinary tract issues, thirst, and something called Fournier's disease, which is so horrific, I can really not even depict it right now. Some of you would run out the door. Basically, it affects men. About 10 times more men get it than women. And it's essentially a flesh-eating bacteria into the male genital area. It kills. It kills. It's a horrible disease, but it's extremely rare. Extremely rare. And you look at the benefits. I know, everyone's going to run out of the church right now. I know. But you look at the benefits of what you're getting here. The major causes of death. Heart disease, cancer, kidney disease, cognitive decline, cardiovascular death, inflammation, hypertension, severe diabetes, kidney stones. And at the bottom, all-cause mortality. And over 50% reduction in you dropping dead. So I'll trade those benefits. I will. It's up to you as to what you want to do. I'll trade all those benefits in exchange for those risks. And I'll clarify this more right now. But the FDA wants you to know about it. And to give you an idea of how rare this is, they looked at 1.7 million users of the SGLT2 inhibitor drugs. 1.7, 12 of them got the Fournier's disease. 12 out of 1.7 million. That's over a 5-year period. And then they looked at people not taking the SGLT2 inhibitors over a period of 30 years, and only 6 got the Fournier's disease. So this may not even be valid, but the FDA is very cautious, so they put this warning on, and you may even see attorneys advertising that if you're taking an SGLT2 inhibitor and you've developed a urinary tract infection, come to me and I'll sue. Well, I'm fully disclosing this right now, and I don't sell these drugs, so I'm letting you know the facts. I try to do that wherever I can. But what are the real risk factors for Fournier's gangrene? Again, horrible problem. Well, type 2 diabetes, that increases the risk, and we're trying to mitigate that with the SGLT2 inhibitors and metformin and healthy diet, healthy programs across the board. But look at this: diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cigarettes, alcoholism, HIV, poor general hygiene. And again, I'm going to get a little gross here, but our feces contain lots of bacteria. And if we don't clean ourselves up really well, and a male gets that into a cut in his genital area, he could develop Fournier's gangrene. Very, very rare, but look, sexual practices, how you behave after you go to the bathroom, has a lot to do with something that is almost non-existent. The overall incidence of Fournier's, 1.6 out of every 100,000 men. Again, very rare. I need to mention it. So the benefits: decreased incidences of the most common causes of morbidity and mortality, including a reduced risk of dropping dead. So the FDA approved SGLT2 inhibitor drugs, all kind of different brands to choose from. If you're going to go to a doctor and ask, it's probably whichever version he's most familiar with. I can't tell you one is better than the other. It's just Jardiance is pretty easy. It's either 10 milligrams a day, 12.5 milligrams a day, or 25 milligrams a day. And what a lot of you can do to save money, buy it from Canada, buy it offshore. If you have health insurance, it may cover it. But if you buy a 25 milligram tablet and then split it in half, that 30-day supply translates into a 60-day supply. So even if you're paying $100 for a bottle of 30 25 milligram tablets, you split those pills in half, well, you've got a 60-day supply. And I think if you shop around enough, you get it for under $100 in different parts of the world. So that's what I'm going to talk about that SGLT2 inhibitors. There is research indicating that this may leap rapamycin as one of the first drugs that the FDA approves to enable healthy aging. Because you can't age healthy if you have high levels of glucose. You can't do it. Going back to February 2020, this was the last service we had before the plague. A lot of you may remember Liz Parrish gave an incredible talk, one of our better services. She talked about research she was doing. Well, I love when people talk about it, including at our church, and then follow through with the science, with a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences earlier this month. This is really a major advance in delaying aging. An intranasal and injectable gene therapy, and she used 2 of them, TERT, which stands for telomerase reverse transcriptase, that enables telomere length to extend. Follistatin was another. They started these mice at the human equivalent of about 56 years, and they used a viral vector to deliver this gene therapy into the mice. And here's what's amazing. The control mice, all dead at 30 months, all of them. The TERT-treated mice were all alive at 30 months. We don't normally see this type of magnitude of difference, where you give a therapy, typically some don't benefit. In this case, all of the mice benefited. They were all alive, and the ones who did not get it, which unfortunately is where we are because we don't have access to this, they're dead at 30 months. And then 50% of the telomerase-treated mice were alive at 38 months. Remember, the non-treated ones were dead before 30. And then 1 made it to 40 months, a really long period of time. That may be equivalent to over 110 human years. And this is median, not maximum lifespan that we're talking about here. The follistatin therapy, that also showed some impressive results. All the control mice dead at 30 months. 56% of the follistatin-treated mice alive at 34 months. So we're seeing 2 different gene therapies tested, and we see that they're working. This is being rapidly translated into hopefully human studies so that we can all derive these types of benefits. And what they were able to see is 41% extension of median lifespan in the telomerase-treated mice, and then the follistatin, 32% increase. Be interesting to try these both together, by the way, to see what happens, because they work by slightly different mechanisms. So this translates into median human lifespans, which right now in the United States is pretty pathetic. It's only about 78 years. You get a lot of unhealthy people, many who die early. There's people who make it way beyond that, but too many who don't. This translates into people living to be about 110 on average. And only supercentenarians make it to 110 nowadays. Extremely rare. But the people or the mice getting these gene therapies made it to the human equivalent of about 110. I can't wait to initiate this type of therapy in myself. Regrow telomeres, more youthful capabilities restored to my cells. This is another graph pulled out of the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences paper, and I hope you appreciate, she talked about that here at the church, February 2020. It's now been published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. And as it relates to the value of this church, of RADFest, of the various conferences we put on, there's a high-level event occurring in San Francisco in a few weeks. I am sending our lead regenerative medicine expert to that conference. The entrance fee, $4,000 to attend this age reversal conference. Now, a wealthy benefactor wrote the $4,000 check. All I'm doing is paying for a plane ticket to send our lead researcher there to figure out what else is going on in the anti-aging field. But the church is free, and the RADFest is, well, about $700, I think, for 3 or 4 days. Free meals included, everything else. You compare $700 to $4,000. And they're different conferences with different objectives, but I'm just letting you know the value of having someone like Dr. Kaufman come up on the stage and give you that kind of presentation, because people are paying big money for it. And I've talked to groups where I've gotten substantial honorariums, which I donate all to the charities, by the way, involved in aging research, and people are paying, in some cases, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year to get a package of events that they can attend to figure out how they don't have to age. The beauty of this church is nonprofit. We don't have the kind of overhead that some of these commercial companies have. So this is the crisis we are faced with in this country. And thank goodness most of us in this room aren't faced with it. We are going to have so many obese people, it's going to be a health care tsunami if we don't do something about it. Obesity, well, that's going to trigger lots of toxic glycation reactions, and it's going to kill us. It's just absolutely going to kill us. So this is where we've come the last 30 years and where we're going. By the year 2030, we are going to be in a mess. So please, take care of yourself. Good news is, big money going into aging research, both from the government and from some very wealthy individuals. And they're talking about drugs to slow or reverse aging. And I talked about the SGLT2 inhibiting drugs, which are approved, being used by millions of people right now. If your glucose level is over 85 milligrams, or if your A1C is over, let's say, 5.5%, consider that drug class. You need a prescription for your doctor, or you might just find them offshore somewhere, but that's my primary recommendation. And the billionaires that keep coming up, there's a lot of billionaires out there, they're getting old and they drop dead. I don't know how that kind of money cannot be used more for aging research. It's not that they don't contribute money to charity, but the charities don't engage in age reversal technologies, so people with a lot of money who have made incredible accomplishments in the world wind up dying just on schedule, die around age 80. And if I had that kind of money, needless to say, there'd be a lot of scientists doing a lot of research because I believe technology exists today to enable us to live potentially indefinitely. So that really much wraps up my little follow-up to Dr. Kaufman's incredible presentation. I know it was scientific, but it's good to understand there is that much science behind everything she said. As it relates to diet, by the way, eating foods cooked at no more than 200 to 250 degrees, that's a great way to inhibit glycation. And I've been trying to do that ever since I learned that in 2003 and published an article about it. So I appreciate the doctor in St. Petersburg corroborating pretty much what I said. Eat foods cooked at low temperature, but as Dr. Kaufman said, very hard to do. You pretty much have to run your schedule around your cooking, and it's very challenging, which is why the compounds that Dr. Kaufman talked about and these SGLT2 inhibiting drugs, they may be a nice solution for you. So I'm open for any questions.